Hello everyone, welcome to today's service. My name's Chad Broom. I'm the pastor of the Trinity Bible Church. This is our YouTube channel. So warm welcome to one and all. Today we're looking at our fourth installment in the book of Matthew. We've been focusing on a couple of the major themes in Matthew. We started off by looking at Jesus, the King of Kings, saying that Jesus is supreme and that he's eternal as King. Then we looked at the kingdom of heaven. And then last week we had a look at holy fear. And we touched on the subject matter of fear. Today we're going to end our study in Matthew, our overview of major themes. And we're going to continue looking at fear and the clash of two fears. Last week I introduced the subject matter. Today we're going to look at it specifically from the book of Matthew. So examples from Matthew about the issue of fear, the clash of two fears. And last week we spoke about holy fear, the fear that we are meant to have towards our Creator God. And then we have the other fear, which is the fear of man and the fear of nations and the fear of all things external that we give allegiance to, that drives our worship. But when God rules our heart, He drives our worship. And that holy fear is so good for us. But let's have a look at some examples, and perhaps we'll be able to understand this concept even more. My prayer, my desire, is that people are set free from besetting fears, and that they find God redirecting, reorganizing, and transforming their lives completely, so that the fears they once had are now gone, and the fear they have now is replaced by the fear of God and a deep understanding of what that means. So I would say, as I start, that Matthew's gospel presents this clash of fears. Matthew consistently contrasts fear of earthly powers with fear of God's king. So there's a tension here. And the key tension revolves around the fear of losing power, the fear of losing status, the fear of losing life, the fear of losing control. And that all those fears, which those are the negative fears, folks, when we're afraid, I'm going to lose control over this situation. I may even lose my life, and I'm not prepared for that. I'm scared to death about losing my life. I'm scared I will go from a person that has some status that people respect to a nobody. I'm scared of losing the little grip of power that I do have. And you contrast that with reverent fear of the Messiah and His kingdom. That's the contrast, and that's what runs through that tension between the wrong fear and the right fear. It runs all the way through the 28 chapters of Matthew. What we said last week is fear that we spoke about. The one type of fear is the fear that ultimately leads to false worship. Let me give you an example of that. Herod is a great example of fear that leads to false worship. So if you're taking points, you might want to make this your first point. Fear that leads to false worship. And our example is Herod. In Matthew chapter 2 verse 3, when Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. What had Herod heard? He had heard about the birth of Jesus from the wise men. He had heard about the one who is born King of the Jews. This troubled him enormously. So now let's have a look at what Herod actually feared. This is wrong fear. What Herod feared was losing his throne. Another king. That's not good. What Herod feared was loss of power and loss of control. Three things a king wants to maintain. Three things a dominant ruler and a dictator wants. They want the throne. They want the power. They want the control. and they want it all in their hands. And anything that threatens that is a problem for them. So what was the result? Well, guess what? Herod pretends to worship. He says to the wise men, let me know when you find him so that I too can go and worship him. In verse 8, Matthew chapter 2 verse 8, that I may come and worship him also. That was an outright lie. You see, his worship has already become corrupted. It wasn't genuine in the first place. All right, so that's the first result of one who has fear. He's going to lose power. He's going to lose the throne. He's going to lose control. And so he has fear, and he pretends to worship. And it makes him deceitful. Because fear produces violence, not worship, Herod's fear reveals he worships power, not God. He serves his throne, not Christ. And we know that his fear produced violence, because when the wise men, under direction by God himself, they went a different way on their way home, and they never passed King Herod, and they never gave him the news about Jesus and where they had found him. And so in a rage, he orders the death, the slaying of all boys 2 years and younger, just to make sure that they've covered the period in which Jesus was born. How terrible is that? So that's what fear does. That's what happens. And so it produced violence, not worship. His fear produced violence. And you see that the world over. Fear exposed the true object of worship. Ultimately, he worshipped himself. Ultimately, he worshipped his throne. He worshipped his own power. And so he wasn't willing to worship God. He wasn't willing to serve Christ. And that's the problem. And so that's fear that leads to false worship. That's despicable, actually. Now, of course, that's the most kind of extreme picture of fear that's driven that way. There's subtle versions as well where you and I can fall into that trap ourselves. But let's have a look now. Second point, fear that leads to true worship. And now let's look at the Magi, the wise men, Matthew chapter 2. And here we look at verse 11. And when they came into the house, they fell down and worshipped him. When they found Jesus, just as they had been directed all along the way, they came into the house, they fell down and worshipped him. There's no pretense here. This was real. This was authentic. This came from their hearts. And you see, they sought him out. They didn't seek him out to destroy him. They actually sought him out to worship him. What did they fear? Because remember, fear leads to, defines what you worship and how you worship. What did they fear? They feared God's revelation. God had revealed. They know that the Messiah was to be born. They had studied the ancient texts and they had discovered this. And so this was God's revelation. They feared the divine authority that was shown to them as the star guided them all the way. But their fear, folks, is awe. Their fear is awe. Their fear is not anxiety. They're not coming trembling out of anxiety. Their fear is awe and wonder and desire to see and to know and to worship. They travel far, so the right fear drives and motivates our actions. They travel from far. They're willing to sacrifice and pay the price and get to where they need to be to worship this one who is born, the King of the Jews. They offer costly gifts. It cost them something in every respect. And they were willing to be extravagant in their worship. And they chose to obey God rather than heaven. Look at chapter 2. Let me just find it here quickly in my Bible. Chapter 2, verse 11. Verse 12. Chapter 2, verse 12. This is what it says. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to heaven. They chose to obey God rather than Herod. That's the picture, folks. That's what happens when there's the right kind of fear. They feared God. They feared the fact that God had revealed through the scriptures that they didn't even know God specifically in this context, but they knew these were holy scriptures, and they had a reverent fear from the start as they sought this out. Folks, holy fear produces sacrificial worship and obedience. We see it in the Magi. Now, another example is fear of the storm versus fear of Jesus. This is found in Matthew chapter 8. Fear of the storm versus fear of Jesus. Now we jump to the disciples in Matthew chapter 8. And in Matthew chapter 8, we hear the disciples exclaim, "What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" You see, folks, they were driven by fear of the storm. They found themselves in a storm in Matthew chapter 8, and Jesus is fast asleep, and they wake him up, and they think they're about to drown. They think this is the end of life, and Jesus steps up and he says, "Be still," and the sea is instantly calm. The raging swell, the sea and the waves bashing over the boat that's about to sink this ship, this boat, just calms down completely, instantly. And they ask the question, "What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" They feared the storm. Now they're looking at Jesus and going, "Who's this? This is something else." The disciples fear the storm first. Look at verse 25. Let me just jump ahead there. Matthew chapter 8, verse 25. Listen to these words. This is them in their fearful state. "Suddenly a fierce storm struck the lake, with waves breaking into the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, shouting," and notice that, shouting, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." Okay? Fear of the storm. What storms are you in right now that you're fearful of? What storms are you in right now that seem to be overwhelming? What did they do? They came to Jesus. That's a good starting point when dealing with wrong fear. Come to Jesus. They did that. But you see, their disciples fear the storm, and then they fear Jesus. Verse 27 makes that clear. "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Their fear had shifted. This is crucial. This is a vital thing. Fear shifts from circumstances, storm, to Christ. And you find them in a situation where suddenly they're confronted by two fears now. Which one's more important? Which one do they bow to? Which one do they worship? Well, it's quite obvious, right? Which one would you worship? Which fear would you worship? You had the fear of the storm and you were about to drown. And then you called on the name of someone who calmed the storm. Who are you going to worship now? Where's your allegiance going to lie now? Where's your fear now? You're no longer fearing the storm, it's gone. You fear Jesus. That's where your fear shifts. Their second fear. First fear was the storm, second fear was Jesus. Their second fear is a worship-focused, a worship-oriented fear. It's an awe. It's wonder. It's like the Magi, the wise men that came. It's like them. There's this awe. There's this desire to know more. There's this inquisitiveness in a way. And it leads to worship. So Matthew shows that encountering Jesus replaces lesser fears with greater reverence. And that's the shift. We said so last week as well, that Christ doesn't just come to remove fear. He comes to replace it. He comes to say, you shouldn't have that fear. I'm going to give you what you need, and that's going to completely revolutionize and transform your life and your heart. When you fear God, all these other things that you fear, well, they become lesser fears. They become kind of insignificant because you start to put things into perspective, just like the disciples did in that boat. There's another fear that we all struggle with. Fear of people. So the fifth point is fear of people prevents worship. And we find this in Matthew chapter 9 and Matthew chapter 12. And we'll get ahead to that. There we go. Matthew chapter 9. So Matthew chapter 9 verse 34 in particular. Let's have a look at that. This is what it says. But the Pharisees said, he cast out demons because he is empowered by the prince of demons. I mean, here's Jesus doing something amazing, okay? He's healing the blind. He's casting out demons. And here's what they say. He cast out demons because he is empowered by the prince of demons. Let's jump ahead to chapter 12. And look at verse 14. Okay, this is what it says. Then the Pharisees called a meeting to plot how to kill Jesus. Jesus was healing people, and Jesus healed on the Sabbath. In chapter 12, that's the specific moment where they plot to kill him, because he healed on the Sabbath. Let me read that passage to you. Matthew chapter 12, verse 9 onwards. Jesus went over to their synagogue, where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. The Pharisees asked Jesus, does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath? Look at what they're doing. They were hoping he would say yes, so they could bring charges against him. And he answered, if you fall asleep, I better put better glasses on. If you had a sheep that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you work to pull it out? Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, the law permits a person to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, hold out your hand. So the man held out his hand, and it was restored just like the other one. Then the Pharisees called a meeting to plot how to kill Jesus. They couldn't say anything because he had made a very pertinent point. Now they want to kill him. So let's have a look and see what's going on here. Fear. What do the Pharisees fear? The Pharisees fear loss of authority. The Pharisees fear loss of influence over other people. And this is an important thing. They want to be able to stamp their authority. They are rules-based. They can't read between the lines. They can't see that they have twisted the rule. They haven't understood the intent and the heart of the rule. They're just going to the letter. So if you look at it again, he says, does the law permit? They said, does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath? See, they've already framed the whole statement as though that would be wrong because it's work. But actually, that's doing good and healing. There's not one of them who wouldn't rescue a sheep in a ditch, a cattle, a cow, whatever, that belonged to them that needed rescuing on the Sabbath. If they didn't do it, that animal would die, because they understood. The idea of do not work on the Sabbath wasn't to watch your animals die if they needed rescuing. It was the consistent practice that you set aside time for God and you worship him. But there's always going to be extenuating circumstances that pull us away to a thing that's urgent in that moment. But those are far and few and in between. That's the reality. But they don't get it. Now he has an opportunity to do good, and they're worried about the law and work. So Jesus puts the question to them. So you see what they wanted authority. They wanted to know that they were in charge. and that they were be able to rule Jesus, to control him. They were scared of their loss of influence over the people. And so their fear leads them to do a couple of things. First of all, they attribute Jesus' power to demons. I mean, how warped is that? That's not the truth. That's completely not the truth. But that's what they decide to do. You see, that's what happens through fear. And they become deceitful and liars. And then fear causes them to plot his death. You see, fear of man hardens the heart against worship. And we've got to be so careful. So that's the fear of man, and that's a big one that for all of us. The Pharisees, we just see in them people who love to be in control. We see in them people who love to wield authority. They didn't really care about the people. Can you see the issue? Jesus comes caring about the people. They come caring about the rules. Jesus seemingly breaks the rule, but he doesn't really break the rule. He just affirms the heart of the Lord towards the person with a hand that needs help. Now let's have a look at this mixture of fear and authority. This is found in Matthew chapter 10. All right, so let's jump back to Matthew chapter 10, and we're going to look at verse 28. Jesus now explicitly teaching on fear. Fear not them which kill the body, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. This is like the crux of the matter. This is Matthew's theological core, the center of it all. Worship follows fear. Fear reveals true allegiance. God alone deserves ultimate fear. And then Jesus comes in and says, wait a minute, let me realign this. Let me reassign the right kind of fear. Guys, don't fear man. Fear God. Fear the one who has power over your soul. Fear the one who can condemn you to a lost eternity. Stop getting this confused. If you get it confused, you worship the wrong thing. If you get it confused, you become like the Pharisees, legalistic to the letter, rules bound, and your heart is hardened. You don't really care about the people. You're worried about rules and outward appearances. Then we have a look at fear. This is what we're going for now, because the moment you accept that God is the one who can condemn me to hell, now we need a fear that leads to faith. You see, I need to come to a place, you need to come to a place where we say, I must fear God. You see, the disciples were able to say, the storm or Jesus. They chose Jesus because Jesus calmed the storm. They're starting to see where our fear should lie. They're starting to also place their allegiance in the right place. So there's a fear that leads to faith. And in Matthew chapter 14, we have Jesus walking on the water. So this is quite an interesting little experience. We'll just move ahead to that passage. I'm going to read from verse 22. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up to the hill to pray, be by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" They were fearful. They were petrified. But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid." And he said to them, "Take courage, I am here." The King James puts it this way: "It is I, be not afraid." Then Peter calls to him, "Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Can you see what's going on here again? The clash of two fears. That's what happens. We live in this world, folks. In the moment Peter sees something remarkable. Jesus is walking on the water. He tells him not to be afraid, and he says, "Call me." And Peter steps out the boat and he walks to Jesus. I mean, in that moment, he's looking at Jesus. In that moment, he's no longer fearful of what he's seen. He's no longer fearful of the storm. He's no longer fearful of Jesus walking on, in terms of well, he's now understanding, I must place my allegiance to Jesus. Walking on the water is a different story than just a storm. And then all of a sudden, his allegiance changes. And he sees the waves. Fear grips him again. Terror. See the words there? That's what it says. But when he saw the strong winds and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he cried. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith." Jesus said, "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. See what happens when our worship, when our fear is rightly placed, when we fear the Lord, it leads to proper worship. When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. The disciples worshipped him, and this is what they say: "Truly, you are the Son of God." That's the picture. That's beautiful. Okay, so here's what's going on. All right, we've got, "It is I, do not be afraid," the Lord says to them. After Jesus saves Peter, they that were in the ship came and worshipped him. They worshipped him. So this is what's going on. The pattern is that fear is what they were experiencing. They see Jesus, still fear. Then Jesus says, "Come, it is I, do not be afraid." Revelation. This is not something to fear with terror. This is now Jesus. Now this isn't fear, this is awe, this is wonder. And so it turns to worship. When Jesus gets back into the boat, also after seeing him rescue Peter from drowning, they worship. Fear transformed by Christ results in worship and confession and praise. This is why we must fear the Lord. It transforms our fear. At the Transfiguration, the Bible says they fell on their face and were sore afraid. Matthew chapter 17. Let's jump ahead to this, and with this I'm going to start winding up this message. Matthew chapter 17 verse 7. This is the Transfiguration. Then Jesus came over and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Do not be afraid." But before that, it says the disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. King James says they were sore afraid. Jesus responds, "Do not be afraid." And that's the whole picture of the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and two brothers, James and John, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, so that his face shone like the sun and his clothes became as white as snow. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Lord, it is wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him." And at that point, it says they were so afraid. They fell to their faces. And Jesus says, "Get up. Do not be afraid." Look at verse 5. Listen to him. Verse 5, it ends with this. "This is my beloved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him." Okay. Fear does not end in terror. when we bring it to the Lord, it doesn't end in terror. It ends in submission to Christ. And so they fall on their knees. And Jesus says, don't be afraid. But it says, listen to him. Listen to my son. Hear him. True worship listens to Christ's authority. True worship takes its lead from Scripture. True worship submits to the authority of Christ and not to the authority of man when they're in competition with each other. We submit to the authority of man in this world. I can't go and break laws and rules, but I submit to the authority of God as the highest authority. If that clashes with man's authority, I submit to God. That's what we're supposed to do. And so here we see that fear and glory and obedience all get mixed together because there's something splendor. So now their fear is awe and wonder, but they're still terrified. They fall on their faces. And in that fear, Jesus says to them, don't be afraid. And then God had said in that moment of declaring, this is my son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. God says to them, listen to him, hear him, follow him. Okay. So as I close, Matthew's final declaration is from Matthew chapter 28. And this is dealing with the fact that you and I must, what's the word I want to say here? We must be proclaimers of the good news. We must learn to worship. Matthew 28, let's just shoot ahead. Sorry about this. Okay, so verse 17 says the following. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some of them doubted. This is just before he says the Great Commission. Then he says to them this, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach them, these new disciples, to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I am always with you, even to the end of the age. All right. That's an important statement. Okay. First of all, Matthew contrasts two fears and two responses. This is what we've got to see. There's obedience, and there's a fear that leads to man's fear overrides truth. That's what I'm trying to say. Man's fear overrides truth. But when we fear the Lord, it leads to obedience and proclamation. And here we have the proclamation we're supposed to think. We're supposed to proclaim Jesus. All power is given unto me in heaven and on earth. The gospel ends where it began. Jesus is king. Fear properly ordered is what God's after. And when we understand that we must fear God, then we worship in the right way. And so this is the pattern. The pattern here is that there's this progression from fear to allegiance to worship. Fear of power, false worship. Fear of people, rejection. Fear of circumstances, panic. Fear of God revealed in Christ, worship, obedience, mission. When we become disciples of Christ, we look at that Great Commission and we go, yes, Lord, I will go and I'll proclaim the good news, because we fear God and not man. Matthew's overarching theological message: you will worship what you fear most, so fear the King of heaven. God bless you. Have a wonderful week, and go out there and fear the Lord only.